Welcome to Party Politics, where we prepare you for your next political conversation. I'm Jeronimo Cortina, political science professor at the University of Houston. Go Cougs.
And I'm Brandon Rottinghaus, also political science professor here at the University of Houston. Wishing I was on the basketball team because we were making a great run. The Cougars are in the Sweet 16. They're dancing still. Let's hope it keeps up, right? And we can talk about this again next week. But as is the nature of March, sometimes you just don't know. The ball might not bounce your way. So we're hopeful.
Yeah, but, it's Blue Devils. No offense to all our Duke fans, but... Right. A Cougar can eat a Blue Devil.
Like all day, yeah. That's like your
for
mealtime.
breakfast.
It's mealtime, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
I feel good about it, but honestly, that is not the end of the madness, right? Basketball is one piece of the chaos that's going all around us, and we've got a lot of things that are happening, both national and Texas politics. The big news of the week, obviously, is that Ken Paxton is able to make a plea deal to get his charges of 9 years dropped effectively. That's an interesting development. I did not have that on my March Madness bracket this year. So we'll talk all about that because it's really obviously a big factor. But there's a lot of things happening all across the country, including in Washington, D.C. The House Republicans have left for the Easter break enraged.
Right.
They have been battered and bad all across the Beltway, and they have not stopped just because there's less legislating to do. Like I mentioned, there's a lot of things that are happening. The biggest was that Marjorie Taylor Greene, representative from Georgia, had basically waved a pink slip in front of the Speaker, Mike Johnson, saying, "We're going to take you out." That's something that may not happen, but that's a kind of major effect, right? I want to talk about that. Also, there were key retirements from House members that put the GOP's potential majority in jeopardy, and obviously Speaker Johnson's ability to kind of hold on in jeopardy too, in addition to Kay Granger leaving the position as House Appropriations Chair. Lots going on. So let's first talk about what's going on in the Speaker's issue. Obviously, Mike Johnson has been in jeopardy, right? This dysfunction is continuing. Do you think there's a chance this time around he could lose his Speaker position?
You never know.
Never know. Yeah.
And here we go again, right?
Yeah, true.
I mean, it can. And basically is the fact that for certain members of the Republican conference, they simply do not like, right, when Republicans have to vote with Democrats. And regardless of what it is, right, if they vote Republicans and Democrats to have vanilla ice cream, they're going to say no. We want it.
Why are you voting with Democrats?
Exactly. It's ice cream. They don't care.
It
right?
doesn't matter.
So, it could happen. Yeah. And if that is the case, we may have Mr. Speaker of the House, Representative Hakeem Jeffries, right? Out of the blue.
I like
and, but it seems to me that Mike Johnson has not been listening to the advice that former Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, and Representative McHenry gave him a couple of months ago, right? Basically, the advice was, there's two things, right? The first thing is that you need to do this job regardless, unless you're willing to lose it, which might be the case.
Maybe.
And also, McHenry told him that, you can either die as a speaker and worry about them taking you out, or you can forget about those things and get things done for the good of the country and build on your leadership. So, it's a tricky one.
It's a tricky one because, this is a GOP that's going to have potentially the smallest margin of a majority in a century. No more, long gone are the days of Speaker Rayburn where you've got an enduring majority that you can basically wield at your fingertips. That's not going to happen anymore. And the thing is that every leader in the Republican Party, and eventually in some cases the Democratic Party, you see them having a target. There's no way to get around that because you're seen as the problem, even if you're not the problem, right? There are all kinds of problems, but that's something that many of these leaders are definitely worried about. And as you say, the kind of proximate cause is that you've got essentially a budget that gets passed because you've got Democrats voting for it. More Democrats than Republicans voted for it. That's not a great look for anybody, but obviously it creates a problem of perception for Republicans who makes it look like they can't govern. In addition, you've got Mike Gallagher from Wisconsin who's retiring. That's also a significant sort of investment in terms of the sort of discussion about China and the information that the state has about China. He was the chair of the House China Select Committee. Ken Buck of Colorado is retiring early. He was also mad about this kind of Ukrainian aid issue. Historically, you try to get members to stay for as long as possible, assuming there's no scandal or any kind of health issue. But in this case, people are just dropping early. And it's creating kind of chaos with the Republicans. The other thing that happened this week was that House Oversight Committee James Comer, who's the person who's essentially responsible for the impeachment hearings on Joe Biden, has indicated that the inquiry will fizzle with no vote. So all this kind of hullabaloo about there being an impeachment and the wrongdoing just went away. None of the witnesses corroborated the evidence, and it just didn't really point in the direction that was going to be useful for them. So again, where is the GOP going here? And are they able to really kind of cobble together a story about why they're the better choice to lead the country? I'm not sure what that looks like.
I don't think that they know.
Yeah.
And you know, we can see these things, but again, you know, they don't have a solid story. They don't have a narrative. But the problem is that given the world of political polarization, extreme political polarization in which we live, these things at the end don't matter.
That's true.
I mean, especially for voters, right? Especially for the rank and file of both parties. It's like,
yeah, it's like kind of water off the back, right? They're not really worried about it. But it does have real world implications.
Oh, absolutely.
The last thing, and the last thing that happened, though, was mentioned was that Kay Granger, who is a representative from Fort Worth, she was in office since 1997. She's the first Republican woman to be elected from Texas to the U.S. House. She's announced that she's stepping down as the powerful chair of the House Appropriations Committee. This is bad because, for a lot of reasons, Texas being in the middle of these legislative battles is good for Texas, right? It means sort of money back to the district, right? In effect, it's basically projects, right? Earmarks.
Right.
These are things that tangibly are things that happen on the ground in the state. And it also means, I think, is reflective of the fact that this is a real loss of clout here. We've talked about this before, but basically fully a third of the delegation has turned over in the past 10 years. That's a lot. And now with Kay Granger going, she's already announced she's retiring, but with her going out of appropriations, it means that there's just this huge gap here. Now Texas only has, 3 different people who are committee heads.
Right.
Mike McCall chairs Foreign Affairs, Roger Williams chairs Small Business, and Jody Arrington chairs the Budget Committee, which is pretty important and impressive, but that's a pretty small number compared to the number of Republicans that Texas sends. So again, Texas kind of losing clout here with respect to this kind of falling away of members thinking that they don't want to stay in Washington anymore.
Right. And again, this is, you know, part of the problem is that, you know, some of these members that are retiring early is, first of all, frustration in terms of the political process.
Yes.
Even though they have, you know, slim, but they have the majority. And then on the other hand is they're tired of these hard-right conservatives, right? Attacking them on, you know, basically, you know, a very solid conservative position.
Yeah, and getting not much done.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like, what else do you want me to do?
And like, can Democrats take advantage? So far, they really haven't. There hasn't been really movement in that, except just to sort of be content to let the other team implode, which is, you know, for a March Madness kind of strategy, maybe not a bad one. But that's not exactly also a reason to kind of encourage people to vote for you. And I think voters really want something to vote for, at least most voters who are kind of really interested in sort of seeing things move. So we'll see how that plays out legislatively. I'm not sure people are paying as much attention to that as they're paying attention to the presidential race. And we have news there, too, this week. Some important outcomes for Donald Trump, actually. He made a pretty good chunk of money on the sale of Social Truth. He might make some money on what is being labeled as, I'm going to just quote this, that a Trump-endorsed Bible. And he says in his video, "Make America Pray Again." The Bible, which is $60, can be purchased and is officially endorsed by the former president. So he actually might make a little money on this, right? Trump-endorsed products definitely have a welcome kind of home for some people. So that might be good because he's going to have to pay a significant bond. It got reduced though, right? So one of the outcomes of the business fraud case that was reported this week was that appellate judges effectively gave the Trump team about 10 days of breathing room and allowed them to reduce the amount of bond needed to about $175 million, which according to him is easy to find. So I guess that's, unlike maybe me, you could probably come up with $100 million, maybe not $175 million, but
in Disney World currency probably.
Monopoly money wise. But he can come up with the actual money, which he's going to have to do. So that's pretty good news for him. The other sort of bad news for him is that in a different case, in the hush money case, it's going to go to trial. April 15th has been the deadline that's been set. This is the case where he falsified business records to cover up hush money payments to hide his affair with a porn star. This is the first time we're seeing a former president go to trial. This will probably also be the only trial that starts and finishes by the November election. Again, do you think this is going to be impactful? We keep kind of talking about the kind of ebb and flow of this because it's news. But again, I think for a lot of people, it tends to be the case that it kind of just passes by, right? It's one more sort of headline about Donald Trump and the legal problems. Is this going to have a continuous, more kind of collective effect as things go on and we get closer to November?
No.
I sort of tend to agree. And we've talked about this polling before, but there's still significant support from Republicans, right?
Yeah.
Like Economist YouGov poll a couple of weeks ago found that 79% of Republicans have a favorable opinion of Donald Trump. That's pretty interesting. But now there are some indications that perhaps people who are in swing states are less likely to vote for him if there's a conviction. So 53% of voters in swing districts said they would refuse to vote for Trump if he was convicted of a crime. A slightly higher shade, 55%, say they would reach that same conclusion if he were sentenced to prison. So, we're not like looking at that exactly right now, but the prospect of there being significant legal problems here doesn't seem to have the same effect. And, he's been pretty Teflon,
right?
Just like his friend Ken Paxton. But for sure, it's the case that this has some small effect on people. Now, how they actually will vote, we don't know. Right. How people say this in a poll is one thing. When you get to the ballot box and you've got to choose who's going to be president for the next 4 years, that's a different story.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that's one possibility. The possibility is that people simply do not go out and vote and have a low turnout election that could complicate things, especially with a third-party candidate that is well-funded.
Interesting. And I think for a lot of voters, they think that they're just being bamboozled all the time, right? It's like both parties are trying to pull the wool over their eyes. Third parties like RFK, right, who's picked a vice president this week. I'm not sure it'll matter that much because most of the time a VP is not that important.
Right.
And he didn't pick anybody who was like terribly kind of known.
Right.
But I do think voters are kind of worried about all this. So we might be looking at one of the lowest voter turnouts of a presidential election in decades. So that would be stunning to see.
Yep.
But obviously the big news of the week is about Ken Paxton. And this is our bailiwick. It's about Texas politics. It's about scandal. It's about GOP and Democrats fighting.
Right.
That's what we do here on Party Politics. And that's what you're listening to. I'm Brandon. This is Jeronimo. Let's talk about Ken Paxton. Platinum Paxton is going to be how I'm going to label this. Hopefully that catches on. We'll see.
All right.
Hashtag Platinum Paxton, because he is impenetrable, it seems. This week, if you haven't heard the news, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton has reached a deal to end the securities fraud charges. After 9 years, the Attorney General is going to have to pay restitution in the order of about $300,000, complete about 100 hours of community service in Collin County, and take 15 hours of legal education classes, which is like defensive driving for lawyers. Big picture, what do you think this means?
Well, I mean, certainly it's a victory for him. I mean, it's a huge, huge victory, especially after the Phelan impeachment trial. Now it's a huge victory. Part of the deal, or I think the logic behind settling this case was that the lawyers in Attorney General Paxton did not want to be on the stand.
Yes.
Because once you're on the stand, then
you can open up to all kinds of questions.
And then you're under oath.
Yeah.
So I think that this indicates that, they were going to do everything possible to avoid him to be on the stand.
And they did. Yeah.
And they did. And, I mean, it's a huge victory. Like, it's, they avoided, I mean, they were looking at the precipice and had just like a cliffhanger with one nail. and suddenly someone throws a rope and pulls
Right.
you over, right?
Right.
But that was it.
Yeah. I think that you could spin this if you're a Democrat to say that, once again, Ken Paxton kind of wriggled out of these charges. There's some truth to that, but a lot of this was sort of hype because there was an expectation that there'd be kind of a conviction. The fact that these are just like serious charges definitely was worrisome for them, and he hired the best attorneys, and they did the best job they could. They delayed, they pushed it off.
Yeah.
They were able to get the venue changed. They were able to kind of debate about how much money the special prosecutors get paid. So eventually one special prosecutor dropped off. So just the churn of it definitely played to Ken Paxton's favor. And it's hard to blame somebody for using every element and every kind of, avenue you have to defend yourself legally. But I think a lot of Democrats look at this and say, this is Paxton getting off again. But the fact is that a lot of the evidence didn't line up, right?
Yep.
Like one of the witnesses who they thought was going to be the person who was going to basically sort of do the most damage suggested in a deposition years ago that they were the reason that the attorney general, then before he was attorney general, didn't register. So the evidence didn't really line up in a way that made it an obvious conviction here. It looked like it was, but then you sort of really dig into it and it wasn't. So the special prosecutors here at least have some responsibility for saying that maybe they overexerted themselves on this.
Absolutely.
But you have to think that, again, like you say, this is a huge win for Ken Paxton.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? I mean, he survived a heated primary in 2022. He was acquitted by the Senate of those charges. So to me, the biggest impact won't necessarily be on Ken Paxton, who already has a pretty fixed sense of kind of where he is politically, but on everybody kind of around that impeachment orbit, especially like Dade Phelan. One of the first things that happened after the news came was that Dan Patrick sent out messages saying that Dade Phelan is to blame for this impeachment, right? This is a sham. He's being harassed. That is going to, I think, have a blowback effect on Dade Phelan for sure, but also the other people who were Republicans who were voted again in favor of impeachment and now are in runoff. So this is going to have ramifications beyond just Ken Paxton, but certainly it's the case that that might matter. Paxton is still not out of legal jeopardy, right? There's still an investigation about him firing some of the whistleblowers. There's still an investigation into his relationship with Nate Paul, the Austin real estate mogul.
That is a federal investigation.
Very also serious. But again, only an investigation. There's a bar complaint against him, so he could potentially lose his law license. I doubt that. It's hard to get disbarred in Texas. Do you think that the rest of this is going to be as impactful as what we've already seen so far? He survived impeachment. He survived federal securities charges. Are any of these other things going to happen politically that's going to hurt him?
I don't know. I mean, and the fact of the matter is, first of all, how much money he has in order to defend himself, because these things are very expensive.
Yeah. And you cannot pay the restitution out of campaign money. It's got to be personal money.
Yeah.
But the defense legally can be out of his campaign money.
So, that's one issue. The other issue is, he has been saying that he wants to challenge Senator Cornyn.
Yes.
Which, I mean, it's another complication, right?
Very complicated,
but
yeah.
He might not.
But look,
who knows?
He's shown to be very effective at moving the base, right? And this week, he is doing many more things that sort of promote that, right? So this was news from last week, but updated to this week, many lawsuits filed by Ken Paxton's office against online pornography companies have essentially shut down the function in the state over the state's law that has an age verification requirement. So last week, Pornhub shut down. And then he's suing other companies to effectively do the same thing. This is a base priming effect. They're also looking at banning TikTok, which is part of this. They've banned abortion. They've limited gambling and medical marijuana as well as recreational marijuana. There's a sense here that the base really does kind of lead the way here, and Ken Paxton is able to effectively communicate to them. So challenging John Cornyn seems like a really prime opportunity.
Oh, yeah.
If he can kind of ride this crest, it could happen. It could be a real battle in the primary.
Yeah, but you never know what happens in a court of law, and especially under these, relationship with Nate Paul and the FBI investigation. Things can get, pretty much complicated. And again, the securities fraud, it's, could have gone very bad, but most of these security fraud cases end up in settlements, right?
Yeah.
It's very rarely when you see something like that. I mean, unless you're Bernie Madoff or, the Bitcoin dude. But you're talking about billions of dollars, right? I mean, those end up in jail time. This one is, like Kim Kardashian, right? That sold something without disclosure, that she was getting
like a
paid.
Martha Stewart, right? Where it was
exactly.
like a kind of, she did jail time, which is no,
right.
kind of,
but it was a nice jail.
It was a nice jail.
I think it was like open and, you have
you
crafts.
can garden most of the day and arts and crafts at noon.
And crafts and cooking and that kind of stuff.
Well, I never want to find out, but I'm going to take her word for it. But you're right. I mean, I think voters are smart enough to look at this and say, look, these charges aren't that impactful. But of course, just the notion of having the attorney general in legal jeopardy and having to go to remedial law school is definitely a problem.
Yeah, that's a problem.
I do think that there is sort of an effect there. Now, whether it's an effect that's going to last into the next election and or be effective in a primary,
I don't know.
I don't really know because that's how John Cornyn's going to come at him to say, like, first of all, you're too extreme. Second of all, you're not doing your job well. Third of all, you've got these ethical problems that we can avoid if we can.
Yeah.
So there is a kind of a credibility effect there that's problematic for him, but hard to know. It's a long time in the future, right? And since it's March Madness, we just play it one game at a time. Right?
Exactly.
Like, we just see.
Yeah.
So obviously, at least for this week, he's able to survive and advance. And
right.
That's what March Madness is all about. Well, speaking of surviving, we know Dade Phelan, the Speaker of the Texas House, is in a serious fight for his political life, and it just kind of keeps getting worse for him. This week, State Representative Tom Oliverson here from Houston announced that he is effectively mounting a pretty surprising challenge to Dade Phelan's speakership. He's called the Republican House dysfunctional. He called Dade Phelan out for his vote on the impeachment hearings. He's basically said that, he's not going to have any Democratic committee chairs. We've talked about this a lot.
Period.
This is pretty common and has been for a long time, but Republicans have been up in arms about it. So I think those days are likely numbers. He's also talked about trying to get to work right away in the session. That's not legally allowable considering the rules that the state's constitution puts into place, but perhaps they can get around it in some various ways. He also suggests that we should elect a Republican from the Republican caucus, and then that's, effectively the speaker instead of having a full vote of everybody.
Right.
That's not uncommon. That's also what the U.S. House does. The interesting thing here is that Oliverson shares a consultant with Dan Patrick. So the kind of scuttlebutt among people watching this say that this is Dan Patrick trying to impose his will on the other side of the rotunda. Now, he's tried this for a long time. He's tried to do it politically against Dade Phelan. Now he can institutionally sort of try to get a new speaker elected. What do you think of the kind of full effect here and whether or not it's going to be a successful challenge?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's going to end up in terms of the House, deciding if they want to be, a subunit of the Texas Senate, basically, right?
Yeah. And do they want to be like D.C.? Because that's really what they're up to here, right? Switching speakers, they're always in jeopardy, pushing conservative legislation that, gets challenged in court.
Especially when you have a session, this past session, where the conservative agenda was pushed miles and miles away, right? And, whether we agree or disagree, that's not the point. The House worked.
Mm-hmm. They got a lot of conservative legislation passed, and Phelan has been bragging about that on the campaign trail.
I mean, and it was done. Mm-hmm. It was done, passed, voted, and signed, something that we do not see in Washington. So I guess if you bring that kind of maneuvering here, I mean, it's just going to be a disaster on the one hand. Mm-hmm. Then on the other hand is what you do to me today, I will do to you tomorrow.
Right. I think the Democrats are just like waiting with,
and eventually, and with every single little thing that happens, they're having a tally, and eventually this is going to shift, right? One way or the other.
You're asking me or telling me?
No, I'm telling you.
If you're asking me, I think. I'm not sure. But I do think you're right that eventually there's going to be...
I didn't say a time. I said like one of these days.
Right. We're living on Mars and the Texas House is like, finally run by Democrats. No, maybe. But I'm skeptical, right? Because just the way things are gerrymandered. But you're right. Eventually there's going to be some movement in that direction. And I do think that what goes around comes around. For sure it's going to happen in the U.S. House. In Texas, we'll see. But for sure this week there's an interesting kind of development. The last thing for the week is a question for the Texas Medical Board. We don't often talk about regulatory issues because it's boring, but really important. This week, the Texas Medical Board issued a proposal guidelines that defined medical emergency exemptions for abortion. This is something that advocates had hoped would kind of clarify when and how doctors can deliver an abortion, but didn't go as far as they would have liked. The guidance does clarify that the abortion is allowed in cases of an ectopic pregnancy, but they did say that the draft rule didn't necessarily shield doctors from who are performing abortions. That's a criminal issue that's separate, they said. So not a lot of guidance from it, just a little bit. Now, Texans can weigh in on this, actually. The Texas Register, which I have my students do, they will recognize this assignment, and that's that you can see what the proposals are from these agencies, and you can comment on them.
Right.
So if you don't like it or you like it, you can comment. What do you think about the political implications to abortion decisions and discussions right now?
Well, I mean, it's going to play a very important role in 2024. And, Republicans that are in at least competitive districts are going to be targeted by this.
Interesting, yeah.
Right?
For sure, that's the case nationally. As the
Yes.
Supreme Court hears cases involving this abortion drug that may be banned, the FDA's power may be limited. The Chief Justice and some of the other Associate Justices were skeptical that we should limit the FDA in this way, but abortion being on the ballot effectively, whether it's literally or not, is something that helps Democrats in Texas and elsewhere.
Well, absolutely. And the implications for the role that agencies play in regulating the spirit of the law that comes from Congress, it has huge implications. And we saw, once again, bedfellows going into, you have Justice Neil Gorsuch, and then siding some sort of with the more liberal side of the Supreme Court.
They only need two to jump over to support the liberals on this, and that's the ball game.
That's a ball game. And in that note, that's it for this week. I'm Jeronimo Cortina.
And I'm Brandon Rottinghaus. Go Cougs.